session of Asia from Animal Day 2022 to discuss about World of Animal Health Organization or OIE standards, as well as relevant regional and national legislation. This session will last 70 minutes with 2 speakers and a Q&A session at the end. My name is Aisyah Nurul Fitri, Animal Welfare Manager of Synergia Animal, and I am honored to moderate this session. So before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded, and if you have any question for the speakers, please use the Q&A chat box and we will hold most questions until the end of the session. Then I will read the questions for the speakers to answer. Now let me introduce our amazing speakers. The first speaker is Paulito Fair from RSPCA, who joined the RSPCA in 1998. In 20 countries in Europe and Asia. Paul is responsible for all of the organization international affairs. As early as 2005, he played a prominent role in organizing the first international farm animal welfare conferences in China, and he continues to work closely with Chinese government, academic, and NGO partners in promoting farm animal welfare science. In recent years, Paul has focused on the development of standards and the mechanism behind higher welfare farm assurance and food labeling schemes. And the second speaker, Sahana Ramdas, is an animal lawyer from India with over 3 years of legal experience in wildlife conservation and domestic animal welfare issues. Sahana has worked on a wide variety of animal law and environmental law issues and also published outdoor in the 2 disciplines during her time in US law schools. Sahana is currently practicing attorney at law in the state of New York. Both of them have amazing experience, right? Now let's welcome our first speaker. Paul, are you ready?
Thank you very much, Asa. Can everyone see that clearly?
Yes, we can see it clearly, Paul.
Thank you. I just want to thank Asia for Animals Coalition for organising and for inviting me to speak. RSPCA has been a member of the coalition for as long as it's been around, really. And this opportunity to share with everyone on this time around Farm Animal Day, running up to Farm Animal Day, is really exciting and interesting. So this session is really aimed at NGOs, non-profit organisations in the animal welfare, animal protection world, who are looking at how we might engage with the World Organization for Animal Health, the OIE. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Before I do, I'll just a little introduction from the around the RSPCA. So as many of you will know, the RSPCA is the earliest animal protection organisation. We're just about to come up to our bicentenary in 2024. We founded in 1824. And quite interestingly, the motivation for founding the organisation was really protection of farm animals, livestock and working equids, working horses and so on, and not really the sort of animals that we're associated with these days, which is predominantly pets. But that's just the way the last 200 years has gone. We still very much have an interest in farm animal welfare, as you'll see. We're lucky to have our own in-house science group, science and policy group, with around 40 scientific and technical staff spread out across 4 departments, covering companion farm animals, laboratory animals, and wildlife. And the job of that team, if you like, that group, is to make sure that our policies and our standards, everything that we write, our guidance for animal care and so on, all of our activities have this sound scientific evidence and practical expertise behind it. So the Farm Animals Department is a crucial part of that team and the largest part of that team, and in the UK is very active in engaging with the food and farming industry also with other animal welfare NGOs, of course, and government directly to promote and support improvements in farm animal welfare. While Britain was a member of the EU, we also had quite an important role in engaging with the Commission or the European Union and influencing the way Europe developed farm animal standards and farm animal legislation. So this team also writes standards for all of the main livestock species, farmed animal species that we use in Britain. And as you can see some examples here, these are what we would call higher welfare standards. So they're quite a bit above the statutory minimum, if you like. And they are used to underpin a farm animal assurance scheme called RSPCA Assured. So the assurance scheme is based on the written standards. The farms apply the standards. The farms are members of the scheme, and also the products that come from animals that are raised under the scheme are then sold in supermarkets all over the country with this logo, RSPCA Assured logo. So it's a farm assurance and food labelling scheme for higher welfare animal products. Just some examples of the sorts of products. This is just a little background really to show you how the RSPCA can be involved in farm animal welfare at a multilateral level, on what basis that we have that opportunity, if you like. And in Asia, as was mentioned in the introduction, we've been quite active from the beginning, really, of farm animal welfare work internationally, in China particularly, with co-hosting of large events, large conferences, and also some on-farm welfare projects as well, although they've been stalled since the COVID pandemic the last couple of years. We also invited farmers from other parts of Asia to the UK to look at our RSPCA assured farms and to look at the sorts of opportunities that farmers have to make welfare improvements in a very practical way. So the main part of my talk really is about the OIE, or which most of us are familiar with, now called the World Organization for Animal Health, which is really a better reflection for most of us of what they do. So OIE was the founding name, set up in 1924 in France, and the original motivation, if you like, the driver for its establishment was the control of animal diseases and the reporting of animal diseases across international boundaries. And as we know, animal diseases have always been a major threat, and as industrial agriculture has grown, even more so. So now we're at a situation where we see the control of animal diseases are really crucial to the economies of countries, of course, to animal health, productivity, and so on, and that these diseases know no boundaries. So it's really important that countries get together to talk about outbreaks in an honest and open way, and to work together to counter them. So that's still the core business, if you like, of WOA, as we're going to call it now. So at the moment, there are 182 member states or territories, and that covers most of the world. If you think about the number of United Nations members, there are about 190 plus. So most countries and territories are members of the OIE. And when I say members, that means that they send a delegate to the OIE, and the delegate is almost always a chief veterinary officer of that country, or other state veterinary service official, and sometimes agricultural health officials are involved in the work of the OIE as well. So all kinds of people involved, but ultimately we're talking about vets from around the world. And they gather in a general session, which is held in Paris every year in May. And this brings this vast number of professional vets, really, and officials to Paris to convene and to agree standards and other work of the OIE. So the basic work involves setting these global standards or guidelines for animal welfare. And although from an NGO perspective, the standards are fairly minimal, they're fairly basic, they're written in a very basic way, they do give us a universally agreed baseline. So they give us all something that we can hang our NGO work around farm animal welfare on. They give us an opportunity to talk to officials with this context of OIE standards. And they also give us an opportunity to do other work to support the implementation of the standards as well. So they're really quite an important function, if you like, and an important mechanism for NGOs to engage globally around farm animal welfare particularly. So the OIE has, or the World Organization for Animal Health has OIE strategy, which is current and gives us the broad framework really. And as you can see, they have 4 strategic pillars. The development of animal welfare standards is crucial, is central to the work they do. They also focus on capacity building and education of people engaged in animal production or livestock rearing or farm animal welfare, lots of names for the same thing. Communicating with stakeholders, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then also obviously implementation of standards and policies and so on in various member countries. They have a regional structure, so they set up regional commissions, and the Regional Commission for Asia and the Pacific is traditionally known as AFAO, Asia Far East Oceania, a little bit of an old-fashioned collection of letters there, but there's also a Middle East Regional Commission, and there's a Europe Regional Commission, which covers many countries that are actually in Asia, so including Russia, for example, and also I think the STAN countries, Central Asia, also are covered in the Europe-Asia Commission. And each of those regions also sets its own regional animal welfare strategy, independently of the global one, but obviously within that context, so that each region can focus on its own priorities, really. And as you can imagine, around the world, there are lots of different environments for farming. There are different sorts of economic pressures, climate pressures, different kinds of animals in many cases, and different breeds and so on. So there are lots of variation and variabilities, and that allows regions to develop their own particular paths. Here, in recent years, we've seen some regions quite progressive in this area, developed fairly comprehensive strategies, and others perhaps a little bit behind, maybe a little bit slower to do that, just frankly speaking, but I think is not a secret. And so this process is being revised and revitalized all the time. So we're going to be seeing more effective regional animal welfare strategies, I think, in the near future. This is taken from their own website. It's an interesting diagram, but it does show the bulk of their work and focus. So as you can see on the left here, there are standards already adopted for most terrestrial animals that are used in livestock and working environments. But they've also looked at other areas, for example, use of animals in research and education, laboratory animals, and also stray dog population control, which is now called dog population management, working equids, as I said, and so on. So they have standards in that area. They've also adopted basic standards for farmed fish. And as you can see, we're looking at slaughter, transport of these animals, the entire life cycle of these animals. They develop other sorts of guidelines around topics and themes, such as disaster management down there, as you can see. And there's always work in progress. So there's a constant cycle of revision and renewal and exploration of new areas of work that are with working groups and so on. So from our point of view as animal welfare NGOs, the focus really is on the animal health codes. And there are two groups of those, the Terrestrial Animal Health Code and the Aquatic Animal Health Code. And the key thing about them from our perspective is the inclusion since 2004 of this section 7 on animal welfare, chapters on animal welfare. And as you can see from this example here, the chapters cover various aspects of the animals' lives, such as the way they're transported and slaughtered, including things like killing of animals for disease control purposes, a very crucial area given the OIE's WOA's role as a disease control assembly, really. And then, as I mentioned, we've got other sorts of animals in different situations, dog population, research and education, and then we've got working animals. So some of the chapters are around species, especially the globally most significant species, which are obviously poultry, pigs, and then we've got cattle and working animals as well. So in the Terrestrial Animal Health Code, this is just an example of the sort of language that's used in the various sections and articles. This is Article 7.1.5, a very basic, fundamental one that appears in the introduction. And as you can see, the wording is fairly straightforward. It's not particularly detailed. It's supposed to be a generic, general statement about any animals in any situation. So the physical environment should allow comfortable resting, safe and comfortable movement, including normal postural changes, and the opportunity to perform types of natural behavior that animals are motivated to perform. You can imagine that when this kind of language is drawn up, there's a process, if you like, of suggestion, amendment, redrafting, and so on, with input from all of the members, potentially. So every member, country, state, territory, will have an opinion about what language best reflects the idea behind this particular article. So that process at the beginning is always very long and potentially filled with conflict or disagreements around particular words and particular ideas. And as you can imagine, there are many languages, and the interpretation of certain words around those ideas may cause some countries to object to certain ways of framing things. The important thing about this is a really good baseline. It is an acknowledgement of some really important welfare principles. It doesn't set a very quantifiable parameter, if you like. We don't see numbers here. How much space? It just says comfortable. So what does that mean? And obviously, in some respects, that can be very subjective and very flexible. So in some ways, the standards are they are a sort of lowest common denominator. All countries can sign up to the principles behind them and the detail, if you like, because they allow for the wide variation in practical considerations and conditions in different countries and different farming systems. But at least you have here a simple principle, which is that if we're keeping animals for food, for other production purposes, for our own benefit, then we should acknowledge their basic needs and the kinds of behaviors that they will need to perform. So there is, it's not perfect, but it does give us a way in to start talking. And it does mean that all the countries that send delegates to the General Session have understood that this is a basic principle and should be reflected in their national regulations or legislation as far as possible. And when things fail, when there are problems, we can point to these very specific articles and say, well, this is not really being applied. As you can see from these photos, obviously the top one is a traditional battery cage for hens, laying hens, and we know that it fails in many ways, and the language of this article doesn't seem to really fit the picture that we see here. So then we would start to talk about alternative systems such as the one below, which I think is in China, which is an indoor barn system with perches and roosts and so on, which clearly is giving the birds a lot more opportunities to perform behaviours that we would want to see. So it's a context, if you like, for NGOs to engage. The Aquatic Animal Health Code is more recent, but also includes a parallel chapter on on fish welfare, welfare of farmed fish we're talking about here. As you can see, there's only 4 chapters there that cover the welfare of farmed fish. But this is obviously an area that's going to grow and grow, as we know. And in Asia for Animals Coalition, we have lots of members who are interested in this rapid development around aquatic animal health. So an important sort of wider context as well is this One Health and also One Welfare, these themes. So One Health is a formal initiative, and it was adopted, I think it was discussed probably earlier, but certainly adopted in about 2009, and named and described in this way. And as you can see, it looks at optimizing the health and well-being and recognizing interconnections between people, animals, plants, and their shared environment. So it's linking the 3 areas of people, animals, and environment, and that the 3 are interdependent. And if we're going to maximize health of people, we really need to consider the other 2 elements as well. This year, a group of 3, tripartite, which was these flags demonstrate, World Health Organization, FAO, Food and Animal Organization of the United Nations, both of those, OIE or WOA. So those 3 were the tripartite, the organizations that came together to work on One Health as a joined up topic. They were joined this year by United Nations Environment Programme, whose mandate is very strictly environment, and also in the broad sense, so including things like wildlife and habitat protection and so on. So now we have what's called a quadripartite since March this year, really potentially quite a strong structure to push the idea of One Health, and WOA, OIE is central to this. So there's another context there, if you like, for us to start talking about animal welfare. One Welfare is a more recent concept which mirrors One Health in many respects. It's still looking at people, animals, and the environment, but also has this broader kind of touch on things like sustainability and food security and improving productivity, which is the One Welfare concept. You can see these links here that will take you to the site, so I will put those up at the end as well. And most recently, another piece of context which I think is useful is this year at UNEA 5.2 in Nairobi in March, the first ever UN resolution was passed with the words animal welfare in the title. So it's quite a milestone for us as animal welfare NGOs. And the resolution calls on UNEP, the Environment Programme, with the other partners in this quadripartite dimension, with their support, to produce a report on this nexus between animal welfare, the environment, and sustainable development. So this report will be presented at a future UNEA. Originally, we were thinking it might be UNEA 6 in 2024. It may take longer to complete the report in the way that the member states would want. But it's a very encouraging development because it does formalize this high-level connection between OIE and the other UN agencies to work on something very practical, which may have very long-reaching, if you like, long-range benefits for animals. So now I'm just going to turn to the structure that we belong to, the RSPCA, and many members, quite a few members, in fact, of Asia for Animals are also members of this structure called International Coalition for Animal Welfare. It used to be called the International Coalition for Farmed Animal Welfare, or Farm Animal Welfare, but was broadened without changing the initials. So it started in 2001, deliberately set up to engage with the OIE at that time, to talk to the OIE about animal welfare. Now, the OIE in 2001 was only just beginning to consider incorporating animal welfare into their animal health work and the animal health codes. So before about 2004, their focus really was on disease control and not on animal welfare. So the standards for animal welfare that OIE developed have only come about since around 2003-04 and have been developed since then in this process that we see now. So ICFOR, this coalition, is really crucial in presenting the interests of animal welfare NGOs and our concerns and engaging positively with the OIE to make sure that we get a voice, if you like, in the development of some of these standards. The current lineup includes 23 of the NGOs here. You can see their logos. And for the last 4 or 5 years, we've had an agreement, formal agreement with the with WOA to support the implementation of its animal welfare standards globally. So this formal structure is really useful. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So the main work that ICFOR does are these 4 points, really. We have an opportunity to recommend experts to key working groups on new areas of work and ongoing areas of work. So we can put forward academic researchers or other technical scientific specialists to sit on these panels and therefore to boost, if you like, the voice for animal welfare and make sure that as far as possible, the latest welfare science, the latest knowledge and research is fed into this process of standards writing. WOA has an animal welfare forum, and we can also take part in that. And also in the implementation side, we can support the work that WOA does at regional levels or even at national levels, OIE representatives, to deliver training in very specific areas, things like slaughter, transport, on-farm welfare as well, and to provide grants to support the OIE's work as well. So actually to provide money for the OIE's World Fund, as it's called, Global Fund, which is used to deliver things like training and also other sorts of projects in countries. And also we're often asked to provide a position statement on particular issues, and some examples here. We've got this antimicrobial resistance, obviously a very big topic with a welfare angle. It's not purely welfare, but it's important. Or on particular species such as the welfare of chickens bred for meat and so on. This cycle of revisions of the standards around particular species or aspects such as transport and so on. And this cycle of revisions is timetabled into the OIE's work, WOA's work. And as that comes up, we have an opportunity to contribute in the consultation process. Obviously, a lot of amendments to the regulations, to the guidelines, to the standards will come in from a very wide range of stakeholders. So you'll have governments who have a view on things, and they're thinking about it from the point of view of practicality, economics, and all sorts of other pressures. If we change the way we farm these animals, what's the likely cost? What's the likely burden? What's the effect on our economy? Academia, you have, as I say, researchers and so on with new science, new animal welfare research that may well be relevant to this particular species or particular aspect. Trade and industry, so clearly we've got the farming industry and retail industry, food business and so on, also with a strong interest in the way standards are developed. And NGO sector, so people like us and members of Asia for Animals. Obviously, some of us have access to our own in-house scientists that can provide consultation responses or inputting into these revisions, and some of us have access to external based on their own knowledge and expertise. And obviously, as we are a very wide range of NGOs involved in ICFOR and beyond ICFOR as well. We will have this practical capacity to do things in countries. So where we are active or present, or we have partners, we can do joint work to on implementation, and we have knowledge about what's happening on the ground with particular species, where the problem areas are, and where the opportunities may be for improvement. And this covers everything from farm animals, but also the other areas that OIE are interested in, such as working equids, stray dogs, so it's dog population management and so on, a very big issue. Wildlife trade, legal and illegal, again, one of the biggest issues around, but not the concern of this particular farm animal day. And also things like disaster preparedness and response, which does include preparing for keeping safe farm animals and making sure that countries are resilient in that area. So ICFOR also has a regional structure. So we have these regional meetings that we have as NGOs that are parallel to the regional commissions that WOA has. And as you can see, this is just some examples of the sorts of projects that ICFOR members might do in particular countries around these different topics. We've got stray dog management here, how to humanely handle, catch and deal with stray animals, working donkeys, working horses. We have here, we have higher welfare, deep bed for pig rearing. I think that picture is in Brazil. So just some examples really, just to give you a flavor. So we have a role to play in inputting into how the OIE devises the standards, and then also on how they're implemented. Just some things for us to think about and remember, really. So WOA is this gathering, this assembly of professional official vets. That's what it is. And so WOA doesn't have its own policies or priorities that are outside those of its membership. So it's there to reflect its membership's priorities as a group, which is clearly a very diverse group with all those members. But it's not there to impose something on those countries. It's there to convene, to bring them together. So that's a really important principle, and that principle becomes more obvious, if you like, and relevant when something bad happens. And as animal welfare NGOs, we look to OIE, WA, OHA, AH, WOA. I have to get used to saying that. We look to them to do something about it, and then we need to be really mindful of what constraints and what scope WOA has to do something about a particular problem. The standards and guidelines are agreed by consensus. So in theory, all the countries have signed up to the ideas in the codes, which are the standards and guidelines. But they are still just guidelines. Obviously, the understanding is that countries will implement them, will incorporate the guidelines as minimum standards into their regulations, into their legislation, if possible. But they're not forced to do that. No country can be forced to do that. And there are no powers, really, very limited things that WOA can do to penalize or sanction a country that doesn't do what it said it's going to do. So when things bad happen, which they occasionally do, then WOA will use these kind of agreed channels to seek assurances from particular countries that they're doing things the right way. And a classic example really is if there's a disease outbreak on a large scale and many countries are not equipped really to deal with them in the most humane way possible. They may not have all the equipment or training. They may prioritize speed over humane treatment, for example. All very understandable things, depending on the severity of the outbreak of the disease and the likely impact on animal populations in their countries. but they may well do things in a way that is less than ideal, shall we say. And in those kinds of situations, clearly the public and our welfare organizations will say, this is terrible, this can't be done in that way, what can we do? And it's very unlikely that WOA can do very, very much other than to make their feelings known that the agreed standards are not being met in this case. And probably better is to think about how to avoid future outbreaks and avoid future problems around humane killing for disease control, for example. So things that we need to do as NGOs, really, how we engage is really important. And the first thing I think we need to do is understand, and this is probably true not only for WOA, but also other multilateral bodies, understand the structure, the functions of different parts of the organization, and the work cycle. So what's the timetable of things, what's coming up next, what's the likely midterm, if you like, sort of 5-year work plan looking like, what can we get ready to input into if it's standards and so on, what are the likely problems, what are the new topics emerging. So these are things that we can be thinking about. We need to also be thinking really carefully about the wide range of stakeholders that are involved in this kind of process, and understand that they are not going to agree. So, for example, most recently, the Laying Hens chapter failed to achieve consensus because there are lots of really conflicting interests of the different countries and different areas. In some parts of the world, cage-free is very well established as a principle. And so for us to start talking about the detail around battery cages and other things, we're going to come up against some resistance from countries where cage-free is a long way away, or where they don't see that it's even possible. And then there are large interests, commercial interests involved as well. Some countries don't want to see things like cage-free spreading very widely because they feel that it will put them at a competitive disadvantage. That's all very understandable, but we need to understand that that's what's going on and how we might be able to mitigate or counter that. We need to focus on building relationships. And that is building relationships with multilateral bodies like WHA, is it's something that has to be done over time. It does depend a lot on personalities, of course, and temperaments of individuals, and there's no secret that previous director generals of the OIE may not have been very well disposed towards the non-profit sector. They don't really see much of a role for us. The current Director General, Dr. Monique Eloi, has been very positive and engaging with ICFOR and enabled the signing of this MOU, which has been crucial to the relationship. So those kinds of relationships are really important, and a sense of trust and understanding of the limits and scope of what WOA can do, and the expectations of NGOs and our members and our supporters, and how we can somehow adapt each to the other. Another thing that I've found, this is probably a very broad point about almost everything that involves government officials or bodies, is to try to establish contacts with officials and other people in positions of responsibility when things are calm. So, for example, if you're an NGO involved in farm animal welfare in your particular country or region, and you want to establish links with officials, veterinary, agriculture, and so on, environmental officials, introducing yourself to them when things are rather quiet and they don't have huge workload or crisis on their hands is the best thing you can do. And you can establish this sense of, well, here I am, this is what we're doing as an organization, these are the kinds of things that we can do. What ways could we support you? And there may be very simple ways that you can do that. So offering positive and practical support is is always good, more so when there's a crisis. So a big mistake that a lot of NGOs make, I think, of all sizes and backgrounds, is only engaging with officials and others when something bad happens, which is the worst time. They really don't want to see you when they're having to deal with a crisis. And in this case, we know disease control I mentioned, but there are other things too where action needs to be taken very quickly. And although NGOs may feel, oh, this is a good point to put pressure on them, we can use this as a lever. It's not a good point at which to make relationships. So I think that we just have to be mindful of what are we trying to do? What's a good time? Is it really helpful to be very hypercritical at this point, or should we use some other channels to make our point known and be future forward looking rather than blame looking? Why did you let that happen? Instead of what can we do to stop this happening again? And also to, when you have things like memorandum of understanding or other sorts of agreements with official bodies, to respect the formal channels of communication. This is how we're going to communicate. When there's a problem, this is what we do, this is what we talk to you about. But also to establish these other side channels of communication as well, so that you have different ways of talking to people and letting them know. And what I've found over time with the OIE and with other organisations is that they understand, they know we have a role to play as NGOs. We're the voice of animals. We are expected to say certain things at certain times in the interests of animals. And so, and their job is not necessarily to agree with us on everything, but to understand that point of view as well. And finally, and this is a universal thing too, it's very difficult sometimes, but we really should avoid undermining each other's efforts in any way. So although we might not agree on lots of things as NGOs, and often we will disagree, we should focus on what we agree on and to coalesce around those shared objectives and consensus, really. But that's just my own ideas, really. Sorry. So just to finish off, some useful links. Just take a picture of the screen if you need to. But I think these four are quite useful. And if you want to follow the RSPCA International Twitter account, or my account, which is a work account as well, please feel free to do that. News comes up from time to time about the OIE and also about other multilateral work as well in working countries. Many thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Paul. This is very interesting presentation and also very helpful advice for NGOs and also veterinarians. So I'm very interested to the Terrestrial Animal Health Code Article 7.1.5, but we have to move to the next speaker. Sahana, you can take over from here.
Thank you. Well, that was a great session. I've worked for an NGO and I cannot agree anymore about how nonprofits have to collaborate and have to keep their agendas aside and work with, a common principle. So yeah, it was a very thoughtful session. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so first of all, thank you to AFA for organizing this amazing event. And it's an honor to be presenting on OIE standards. And it's a great opportunity to meet like-minded animal advocates. So today's presentation is going to cover the legislative framework in India when it comes to cattle welfare. Through this presentation, I'm going to take you through the legislative framework and to see if the 5 freedoms which OIE propagates has been ingrained in the legislative framework of India. So most of you would know that India is one of the largest producers of dairy products and is also the largest dairy consumer in the world. India also happens to be India also happens to have most number of livestock animals, and especially cattle population. In 2019 alone, India ended up producing 81 million metric tons of milk, and is also the largest milk consumer for the last couple of years. India has over 300 million bovine animals. When I say bovine, I mean cow, buffaloes, bulls, bullocks. All of these cattle animals are also, termed as bovine animals. So, and the dairy farming industry alone provides a form of livelihood for around 150 million people in India. So as you can sense, it's a big industry, so the question of whether cattle welfare is guaranteed through the legislative framework is up for debate. So when it comes to the OIE standards for animal welfare, the OIE mainly focuses on whether an individual animal's well-being is taken care of by people who are using them in any industry per se. So from the time of an animal's birth to the time of its death, whether its welfare is regarded, considered, and taken care of. That is the core of the 5 freedoms. So yeah, OIE goes on to say that any animal requires good welfare, and it should be kept in a healthy, comfortable, well-nourished condition, and it should be free from unnecessary pain, suffering, and unpleasant experiences. And also, if you look at the language here, the OIE is implying and also is recognizing the fact that animals are sentient beings which are capable of undergoing pain, suffering, and feeling different set of emotions. So it all boils down to the 5 freedoms. That is the freedom from discomfort, freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from pain, injury, and disease, freedom to express natural behavior, and freedom from fear and distress. And all of these boil down to the fundamental right to life, the core idea that every living being, or at least when it comes to the legal society, we guarantee this to humans, but not to animals. But OIE propagates the same for animals as well. So in India, the overall framework boils down to the Constitution of India. The Constitution of India has directive principles of state policy which speak about ahimsa, like non-violence. So a couple of provisions under the directive principles of state policy talk about compassion for animals, having a more scientific and humane temperament when dealing with them. And the main legislation when it comes to protecting animals is the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. This is the national legislation which forbids unreasonable forms of cruelty and also addresses animal welfare issues. And this particular act criminalizes many acts of animal cruelty. However, it has a utilitarian exception, meaning it is okay to kill animals for food, for animal experimentation, and for religious sacrifices. So the act's language, if you see, it says it to prevent unnecessary pain and suffering, implying that humans' demand for food and animal products justifies infliction of pain and suffering when it comes to animal products. So under the PCA's umbrella, there are a couple of more central rules which revolve around how bovine animals are treated when it comes to moving them around as pack animals, or how we treat animals which are used in farming. So again, the transport of animal rules on foot as well as in the train or in the truck is governed by the Transport of Animal Rules of 1978 and 2001. And these cover in what conditions can an animal be transported from point A to point Z. And the PCA registration of cattle premises and PCA slaughterhouse rules also look at to what extent can we promote animal welfare before they slaughtered or before they sold off in the cattle market. So in the coming slides, I will be touching upon how most of the legal provisions under these sections adhere to the 5 freedoms. There, you will see that there are many sections within these within the central legislative framework, which actually make enough room to promote cattle welfare. So like I was saying, the Constitution of India, within the Constitution of India, there are these directive principles of state policy, which are not binding, but they are the guiding or, guiding navigators to what the Constitution requires Indian citizens to abide by. And again, but then the fundamental right to life is a guaranteed legal right to life. So under Article 48, which is a directive principle of state policy, it says that the state shall endeavor to organize animal agriculture and husbandry on modern and scientific lines. In particular, take steps to preserve and improve the breeds and prohibiting the slaughter of cows, calves, and other milch and draught cattle. So this particular DPS has been up for debate, and there have been many Supreme Court and High Court judgments which have dealt with this particular issue, whether animals could be slaughtered, and especially cattle animals, and whether it is whether it's a violation of the principle, or if it's simply okay because people who engage in the trade of slaughter people who engage in the trade of slaughter are still allowed to slaughter animals regardless of the principle. So in this particular case, Muhammad Hanif Qureshi versus the state of Bihar, a couple of religious minorities from the Muslim community filed a petition saying that their fundamental right to trade and their fundamental right to practice religion was being infringed by this particular complete prohibition on the slaughter of cattle. But then the Supreme Court held that not really, it is not an infringement of the fundamental right to practice religion or to even practice any trade, because although they were being prohibited from killing cows during religious sacrifices, they could still go about sacrificing goats or camel, etc. So it is not a complete prohibition, when it comes to exercising what they wanted to do. While making this judgment, the Supreme Court kind of implied that this particular article only prohibits the killing of cows and bulls and bullocks which have no economic value. Again, that meant that people could nonetheless kill old cattle, like old cows, old male bulls and buffaloes and bullocks. So soon after this judgment in 2005, there was one more case, the state of Gujarat versus Mirzapur Moti Qureshi, which basically replaced the previous judgment and said that the complete prohibition of cow slaughter is acceptable because the Article 48 requires a prohibition of cow slaughter regardless of the economic value. And again, the Supreme Court did not heed to the constitutional arguments which the petitioners made, saying that such a totalitarian ban on their right to practice religion or right to practice any form of trade was being infringed upon. And while these judgments were being passed, the Supreme Court and the High Courts involved also touched upon the Article 51 AG, which seeks Indian citizens to practice compassion towards animals and also to protect the environment and wildlife. And Accordingly, UN 51AH seeks citizens to develop a scientific temper and evolve as humans, and uphold principles which are more inclined towards being morally abiding legal citizens. The most important article which I would like to touch upon is Article 21, which is not a directive principle of state policy, but it is a fundamental right to life. So in 2014, the Supreme Court passed one of the greatest animal law judgments, where it touched upon how the right to life should also be guaranteed to animals, and animals have an equal right to a life of dignity and free from torture and unlawful forms of barbaric cruelty. This case was relating to using bulls, buffaloes in a religious and cultural sports racing events called as Jallikattu, but then it also touched upon how animal exploitation in the agricultural industry is unacceptable, and how the right to life is meant to be extended even to animals. So these judgments kind of start reflecting to what extent the 5 freedoms are being extended to cattle welfare, especially because of how the DPS talks about protecting cows because they're milch and draught animals. So I'm going to briefly highlight as to how a couple of legal provisions within the transport of animal rules addresses how animals should not be subjected to hunger, thirst, deprivation of basic amenities, and how when they're being transported, they should be free from being afraid and feeling any form of discomfort. And also, last but not the least, to see to it that when they're being transported, people who are in charge do not inflict unnecessary, or when I say unnecessary, I'm referring to the legal provision. Any forms of cruelty is unacceptable, but there's a certain legal standard which makes it okay to subject animals to human use and to the societal needs. So yeah, freedom from distress, pain, injury, and disease. So when it comes to freedom from hunger and thirst, the provisions say that there should be adequate amount of food, ration, and water to be carried for the journey. Medical boxes have to be there when they're being moved around. They should be loaded only after they're being properly fed and given water, and then food and watering arrangements have to be made for the journey, so that even in emergency situations, they're not left stranded. And milking cows, which have just delivered calves, should be milked twice daily so that they're not clogged, their systems are not clogged, and their calves should be given sufficient quantity of milk to drink. Cattle must be moved only during night. So this is an interesting provision. It's basically addressing the tropical climate in India and how more often than not, when cattle are moved during daytime, they experience severe forms of dehydration because of the torridity of the heat. So that is why it says cattle must be moved during nights only. And not able to see this. Yeah. So during daytime, they should be unloaded, fed, given water, and rested and milked frequently. So when it comes to freedom from fear and discomfort, again, adequate space be provided for cattle whenever they're being transported either through a train or through a vehicle. And ramps, ropes, platforms must be provided so that when we are loading or unloading cattle, they don't end up with fractures. Again, adequate ventilation shall be ensured so that the stagnant air does not get to them, which might make them susceptible to diseases. limited number of cattle to be transported at once so that we don't overwhelm them or overstress them. Confined areas. And throughout this journey, at least one human attendant has to be there to take care of their needs. So when it comes to freedom from distress, pain, injury, and disease, during this, in most of these central laws, it is essential for a veterinarian to give a certificate that the animals are fit to travel and they're not suffering from diseases, so that they do not pass on contagious diseases to others. And also they do not unnecessarily suffer while being transported. And to avoid distress, rules speak about how they should be loaded parallel to the rails so that they're facing each other, so that they feel that they're all in this together. And cattle should be placed preferably facing the engine to prevent them from being frightened or injured. This usually happens because when they are not thoughtfully situated within the truck, they might end up panicking and they might end up engaging in stampede despite of the area being limited. To avoid such situations and to avoid them from going through this whole panic mode mentality, the provision requires them to be facing the face of the vehicle. Cattle in advanced stage of pregnancy shall not be mixed with young cattle in order to avoid stampede, just like what we were referring to before. And again, if cattle need to rest while being transported over long distances, sufficient amount of padding needs to be provided so that they don't end up hurting their limbs and go through undergo pain and suffering in corrosive environments. So as we see, the transport of animal rules has covered a lot of situations which animals are put through, like cattle, bovine animals are put through. And these rules require human handlers to make appropriate arrangements so that animals do not go through distress situations such as the ones which you just covered. Now, moving to slaughterhouse rules, you will see similar such language here as well. So animals can only be slaughtered in recognized and licensed slaughterhouses, just so that there's better scrutiny, there's more of regulation as to in what manner are they being slaughtered. And similar to what we saw with transport of animal rules, an animal which is pregnant or which has an offspring, which is more like an infant calf, or has not been certified by a veterinary doctor that it is not fit to be slaughtered, should not be slaughtered. That's one of the core rules of the Slaughterhouse Rules of 2001. The other one is that any resting area where they're being kept before the slaughter should have sufficient amount of water, feeding, and enough space to shelter the animals. And separate isolation pens so that animals which are suffering from contagious diseases are kept in isolation and they're not mixed with healthier or fitter animals so that diseases don't pass on. Slaughterhouses need to ensure that animals are not slaughtered within the sight of animals. This is to avoid distress situations. Again, because they're sentient beings, they can they more often than not end up releasing a lot of stress hormones when they're subjected or when they end up seeing other animals being slaughtered. Yeah, and then a separate space for stunning of animals before they're being slaughtered. So if we see, even before cattle animals are slaughtered or any other livestock animal is slaughtered, there is adherence to the 5 freedoms. There are legal provisions which address or which try to comfort animals and prevent them from being distressed, provide them basic amenities, etc. Okay, so this, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, the transport of animal on foot rules. So this is when animals are being moved from point A to point B on foot, not through a truck, not through a train wagon, but just on foot. So in this, again, that only animals which are in a healthy and good condition can be transported for food, although they're being transported on foot, saying that you cannot subject animals to travel long distances if they're not in a healthy and good condition. Just like what we saw before, protect animals which are newborn calves, old, diseased, disabled, pregnant, and recently delivered female animals should not be transported on foot. And this is a pretty advanced provision which refers to how animals can only be transported in their social groups, again, to avoid distress, to prevent them from feeling uncomfortable, lost, or confused in different environments without feeling like they're a part of their, without recognizing the fact that animals are not just belong to a social group, but they're also pack animals. And again, first aid equipment has to be used while being transported. Prohibition on the use of whip sticks during transport. More often than not, humans end up using aggressive forms of trying to domesticate livestock animals, and in order to make them submissive, physical forms of cruelty are inflicted upon them. And the section 11, rule 11 specifically refers to not applying chili and not applying, not using harsh ingredients on them, just to get them to be submissive and listen to human handlers. And if the animal needs to be tied, they only need to be tied with comfortable clothing, and an animal should not be tied through their nose and legs, and only to be tied through their neck. Again, this is to prevent them from ending up with fractures, serious forms of injuries, and just to keep them comfortable. This goes back to how the other transport of animal rules have been framed, that animals should not be transported before sunrise or after sunset. Yeah, but this goes about this is the exact opposite, because when they're being transported through a truck or through a train, they can succumb to the tolerability of weather when it comes to tropical climate. However, it is not prudent to transport animals on foot before sunrise and after sunset, because when people are on the road, when people are traveling through their automobile, they will more often than not be able to locate the fact that animals are being transported on foot, and it can lead to accidents. It can lead to severe injuries to the humans involved as well as animals involved. And that is why this provision says that animals cannot be transported before sunrise or after sunset. So the other one is that no animal shall be transported on foot beyond the distance, time, rest interval, temperature specified for such animal. Going back to how weather and climatic conditions are also kept in mind, were kept in mind when these rules were framed. So in 2014, Animal Equality and a nonprofit conducted an undercover investigation about how cattle, especially cows and milching cows, were being treated in the dairy industry. And the outcome of the undercover investigation was pretty brutal, and it highlighted what goes on in the dairy industry. Now, like we were discussing, because India is one of the largest dairy producers, when the white revolution set in, industrialized animal agriculture became an integral part of dairy farming. And because of which the adherence to animal welfare standards has been severely compromised. So dairy cows are often injected with oxytocin, antibiotics, and other unnatural substances just to induce, basically growth hormones are used to induce milking in them, to rake up the profits and to reduce the amount of time it takes to come to create a byproduct, be it a dairy byproduct or be it an animal byproduct. So a lot of forbidden, unnatural substances are used just so that they can accelerate the production of dairy products. And because of this, almost 80% of the cows and buffaloes are artificially inseminated, and they're artificially impregnated and forcefully impregnated by unwilling male bulls and male buffaloes. And in order to keep the business going, and calves are immediately separated from their mothers so that the milking cows are put back to business, and in order to churn out milk and to keep them producing milk for human consumption. Calves are immediately separated and not given time for the mother to heal, not giving the calf to be nourished before separating them. And one of the most obnoxious practices is where the dead calves are not just immediately separated, but they're stuffed with hay to trick the mother to think that the calf is in distress, and the calf's head is put up like a trophy in order to instigate the mother to produce more and more milk, thinking that by doing so, by producing more and more milk, the distressed calf, which is the dead calf, which is put aside, would be given the milk which it requires or which it deserved. And more often than not, cattle workers and farm owners end up medicating cattle which are in need of care by themselves. So it's like self-medication, leaving these animals in a more injured state and often with untreated diseases. And this leads to animals succumbing from such ill-maintained conditions. When we were looking at the transport of animal rules, I referred to a specific rule which said that animals should not be physically mishandled or manhandled, and how humans should not be, caretakers should not be using chili and sticks and things to prod them, but then beating buffaloes which are being transported or just harming them is a routine and standard practice. Dairy workers often twist and break the tails of cattle, rub chilies and shove sticks just to make them submissive, just to oppress them and get them to listen to the caretakers. And more often than not, regardless of what the transport of animal rules says, more than 30 cattle, that is more than 30 cows or any form of bovine animal, are cramped in trucks or in rail wagons. And this often leads to vulnerable cattle getting subjected to all forms of lacerations, severe wounds, fractures, and often in fact succumbing to such distress situations. So if we see the rules which address the 5 freedoms have not been of much help when it comes to protecting cattle welfare when they're being moved around or when they're being used in the dairy farming industry. And this is it's not just a violation of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act or the constitutional principles, but it just shows that the lack of enforcement or the lack of implementation of the animal welfare rules often leads to cattle animals being subjected to different forms of cruelty, where they're kept under inhumane conditions, where adequate food, water, shelter is not just provided, but also they've been severely deprived of. And even like basic medical care is not provided to animals which are in dire need of medical help. So in order to address all of these, there were 3 back-to-back Supreme Court. One was a Supreme Court order, and the others were High Court orders, which referred to how animals, especially cattle animals, were being transported. So in Gauri Muleki versus Union of India, the petitioner highlighted how cattle animals, especially buffaloes and other cows, were being illegally smuggled to Nepal for a religious sacrifice during the Gandhi Mai festival. And taking note of the atrocious conditions, the Supreme Court passed an order in 2014 asking the Animal Welfare Board of India, which is one of the main regulatory bodies which is in charge of enforcing animal welfare rules and animal protection policies. So the AWBI was asked to frame appropriate policies to address this form of illegal smuggling of cattle, and to prevent them, to just basically prevent the illegal transportation of animals to different parts of not just the country, but also outside the country. So adhering to this, the AWBI came up with the Livestock Animal Rules in 2017, and the Livestock Animal Rules addressed the illegal smuggling of cattle and also tried to improve the living conditions of cattle. However, because it was entangled with a couple of other provisions which try to restrict cattle trade only when it comes to the slaughtering of cattle, meaning forbidding a certain section of the society from cattle trade when they wanted to engage in cattle trade for the purposes of slaughter, and in the meanwhile permitting cattle trade in the dairy farming industry. So it led to, again, many petitioners going before the Supreme Court and High Court saying that it was an infringement of their right to trade, right to religion, right to practice, freedom of expression, etc. The Livestock Animal Rules did not come into fruition. So a lot of legal provisions which try to address the living conditions of cattle when being transported, or how they were kept, has not gone into full effect. The other one, though, the Narayan Dutt versus Union of India and Karnail Singh versus the state of Haryana, are some really good judgments about legal personhood rights, which refer to how animals deserve legal personhood rights regardless of them being non-human species. And these 2 petitions were brought against the illegal transportation or unlawful transportation of animals. And again, the petitioners highlighted in what conditions cattle were being kept and how they were being treated when being transported. So in both the judgments, the High Courts upheld, the High Courts recognized the fact that animals deserve legal personhood rights, and how the citizens of India, the citizens of the state, have to take up the responsibilities of enforcing legal provisions, protecting animals as legal guardians. So I'm getting to the conclusion now. So just to surmise, the entire legal and regulatory framework governing cattle welfare in India boils down to this.
I'm so sorry, Sahana. We're running out of time and the other session has to start soon. So yeah, we have to finish it within 1 minute. Thank you.
Sure, sounds good. Okay, so to surmise, the 5 freedoms are upheld by a couple of these pillars. I'm just going to highlight the jurisprudence doctrines, the parens patri and loco parentis. These jurisprudence principles have been upheld by the High Court judgments, which says that the government and the citizens of the country are responsible for protecting the legal rights of animals, and how these jurisprudence principles could be used to enforce animal welfare provisions, especially when it comes to cattle welfare. In conclusion, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act penalty provisions have to be amended, because since 1960 they have not been amended, and because of which it's not having a deterrent effect on different forms of cruelty, and animal offenders are going almost scot-free with meager fines and penalties. Strict enforcement of existing animal welfare provisions is essential, because the laws are quite are very well framed. They're quite thoughtful, but then the lack of implementation and enforcement is crippling the tooth of these provisions. So again, mandating training to cattle workers so that they're going to be more humane towards cattle, and establishing a cattle welfare committee in every region so that they could enforce the cattle welfare rules. And switching to non-dairy products would be a better alternative, and granting legal personhood rights would uphold the fact that animals are intrinsic, essential for our well-being, and they deserve inherent rights, because they play such an important role in the ecosystem. Thank you. I think that comes to the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Paul and Sahana. I think we're running out of time, so I'm so sorry for this session. We won't have Q&A session, and if you have any question, you can send me email that I share on chat, so I can connect you with Paul and Sahana. All right, I think the time is up. So thank you all thank you for our amazing speakers, and also thank you for participants for attending this session. I hope this session will enlighten our knowledge about animal welfare legislation and also monitor the implementation. Now, may I pass it back to the team, and please enjoy the rest of 2022 Asia Farm Animal Day sessions. Have a great day.
Thank you, Isa. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.